Good afternoon. It is now 1 p.m., so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome. My name is Whitney. Today, you are here for the D&I Essential Leadership Competencies Workshop, and we'll be discussing knowledge. So while we wait, there will be a few others joining. Feel free to insert your name, your title, and your company into the chat box so that the other attendees, as well as the panelists, will just get an idea of who's in the room. So I am the Director of Employer Engagement for Talent 2025. I'm also the Diversity and Inclusion Officer for Talent. These workshops are a collaborative project between the two. We have reserved time for questions and answers. So please feel free to enter any questions you have into the chat box throughout the duration of the meeting. I will monitor the chat box. I'll act as a facilitator for the workshop, and I'll share any questions with the appropriate person during the designated time. So after this workshop is over, you will receive a follow-up email. That follow-up email will contain a PDF version of the presentation, a temporary link to access a recording of the session, any highlights from the session, and then also a survey. With the recording, we will only record the actual panel and then the intro remarks. The breakout rooms will not be recorded. And then for additional information, please visit our websites, talent2025.org, talnet.org, and then we also have a few options for you to access a copy of the D&I guidebook. We'll kick things off by talking about workshop objectives. The very first thing we want to do is support the professional development of D&I practitioners. The second thing we want to do is facilitate discussions that lead to the practical application of the content shared during these workshops, but then also within the D&I guidebook. We want to amplify the voices of D&I leaders in the region. So for all of these workshops, I have invited my contributing authors for the guidebook, but then also there's various other D&I practitioners who are registered and attending these workshops as well, so that you can hear from them. The fourth thing we want to do is just create a space for networking so that we can all listen, learn, and continue to grow together. So here is our agenda. I'll kick things off by just making some connections to the guidebook. We'll look there to kind of define knowledge and provide some supporting materials. And then we'll turn things over to our panelists. I do have 3 panelists that I'm very excited to introduce later on. So you'll be able to hear firsthand from them. They'll show some of their knowledge, experience, resources, and additional insights from their leadership as a D&I practitioner within their organizations. We'll close out the session by having small group discussions. We'll utilize the breakout room feature for that. And then I will just kind of share some next steps as a wrap up and close as well. So I want to kick things off with a poll just to once again better understand who's in the room. The poll question is, are you the designated D&I leader within your organization? These workshops were designed for anyone with D&I responsibilities within their organization. So I know that that looks different within every organization. You could have like a chief diversity officer. You could have a human resource leader with D&I responsibilities. You could be a person in the organizational development who has these roles, but you could also even be the CEO of your company. So I've worked with all of those different job titles within various organizations to help advance D&I. So now we'll kick off the poll. Are you the designated D&I leader in your organization? Yes or no? Give you about 30 seconds to answer that. All right. Majority of the meeting attendees have answered, and the response is yes. 13 people on this meeting, or 42%, said that yes, they are the designated D&I leader within the organization, and then another 18 answered and said no, they are not the designated D&I leader. So 42% said yes, and 58% said no. Thank you for your participation. We are here today to talk about some of the content included in the Diversity and Inclusion, 5 Essential Leadership Competencies of an Effective D&I Practitioner guidebook. This is a new resource that became available at the end of 2020. So literally December 31st of 2020 is when we published this resource, but then we started kind of socializing it and sharing it within our networks in January of 2021. So I'm really excited to share this resource with you. I am one of the authors. I actually have 15 contributing authors who shared their knowledge, experience, insights, personal experiences to help contribute to this. So here are my 15 contributing authors. I'm really excited to have Dr. Michelle Loyd-Paige, Robyn Afrik, and Ken James here with us today. But I just wanted you all to know that this was a collaborative project that would not have been possible without these awesome leaders. So the purpose of this guidebook was to document the essential competencies, roles, and responsibilities of D&I practitioners. Inside the guidebook, we detail what they need to know and be able to do to be effective in their role. And this document has multiple uses. It could be a training supplement. It could be a reference for leading practices. It could also be a resource list that any D&I practitioner or person passionate about D&I could use to kind of reevaluate your skills and also elevate them as well. Fields evolve in stages. During my research, I leaned on or leveraged the Innovation Network for Communities, and they have some great resources on field building. So pretty much fields evolve in stages: framing, networking, maturation, and standardization. And given the research that I did and just kind of talking to people and networking here in West Michigan, it seems like we are currently at stages 1 and 2. So this framing has happened or is happening, where there is some isolated practice examples of what's going on within companies, what works well, what doesn't work well, some opportunities to improve. But then there are also, the industry is very fragmented, honestly. D&I is a highly networked field. There's not necessarily standard processes and procedures that are being implemented across all organizations, all industry sectors. Education seems to be leaders in this, where they have some national standards, but not necessarily every industry sector has standards as it relates to D&I or the implementation and things like that. More of that is included in the D&I guidebook. But we hope that this resource, these convenings, these meetings, and everything together will help us move along on the continuum. Inside of the guidebook, there are 5 major competencies that we talk about. So the first thing is personal characteristics. These are the factors that collectively help a person develop and foster meaningful relationships. On March 3rd, we had a workshop on that. And once again, this is a series of workshops. So between now and June, we'll have one workshop that focuses on all of these competencies. Today, we are here to talk about knowledge. So it's a foundational understanding of D&I and pretty much a desire to continuously learn. The other 3 topics that are foundational competencies that you'll find in the guidebook are planning, leading, and communication. So planning is really just the ability to envision an ideal future state and then develop the necessary steps to achieve it. Leading is the ability to influence people and systems to move the work forward. Communication is the ability to receive and share information and pretty much tailor a message in a way that it resonates with multiple audiences. So just kind of doing a deeper dive into the knowledge definition. In order to be a D&I practitioner or to effectively lead this work, it requires a foundational understanding of multiple diversity and inclusion topics. Some of those are included in the guidebook, and we'll talk a little bit more about them today. But it's really a willingness to engage and continue learning, because the field is always evolving. So new language, new research become available, new research and studies, new practice examples, things like that. Once again, D&I is a highly networked field, and the collective impact is more important than having the competitive advantage in this space, which is why I think people are so willing to help others kind of build their networks, talk about and share experiences. So inside of the guidebook on page 30, you'll find Dni Competency Statements. So on the left-hand side, we list examples of what a Dni leader needs to be able to do, what an effective Dni leader needs to be able to do. And then on the right-hand side, the columns here are examples of what that actually looks like in the workplace. So number 1, an effective D&I officer should be able to develop content knowledge that is critical to effective D&I strategies. And here's how you do that. There is, of course, understanding the key content areas of D&I. I should start by saying it's impossible for one person to know everything. You may have heard that before if you attended previous workshops from this guidebook framework or just other panelists and things like that. So it's really impossible for one person to know everything. But there are a few things that are considered to be foundational. So things like bias, cultural competence, depending on what your role is within a company, legal compliance, historical roots of racism and civil rights, systems of oppression, power and privilege, and then diversity within hiring. I feel like those are really good foundational things to start with if you are going to lead D&I within your organization. But there are additional topics listed in the guidebook, and we'll probably get to some of those later as well. You have to be willing to engage in professional development. Many D&I practitioners that I talk to, of course, the work or their workplace is kind of providing some resources and some funding, but they are just really ambitious and driven to learn on their own as well. So in their free time, they may be watching movies, reading books, attending conferences and webinars, things like that. So engage in professional development and then obtain any relevant certifications. The second thing that a D&I leader needs to do is create personal knowledge networks. So that could include leveraging the insights and wisdom of people within your own company, but then also building some trusted partnerships with other D&I leaders, both in your industry, in your region, and beyond. Connecting with other leaders who represent different dimensions of diversity. So just being intentional about talking to people who are different than you, who look different, who may have a different upbringing, who maybe are from a different state, who have different roles within their companies. Seeking out those connections. Mentorship is very important. And then also joining any type of development groups or associations that you think would be good for your organization and your current state. The third thing that a D&I practitioner needs to be able to do is research D&I standards and best practices, especially those that are relevant to your specific industry. So that could involve attending relevant trainings and conferences and seminars, both on a local and national level. It could include studying and applying national standards, building your cultural competence to understand things in the US are very different than things on a global perspective. So just depending on what type of company you work for, that's really important. But then also just on your personal journey, you have to just kind of be aware and understand that the way we may do things in the US could look very different than how they do things in another country. So those are our competency statements for knowledge. So just some things to frame the conversation to be aware of. Once again, these are on page 30 of the guidebook if you want to take a closer look. And then on page 31 of the guidebook, you would find some additional topics. So are there any questions so far? Once again, I will monitor the chat box. Please drop any of your questions into the chat box. Give it a few minutes to see if there are any early questions. Can you share more on relevant certifications? Yes, I can. So in the appendix of the D&I guidebook, there is a list of certifications, but I will encourage our panelists to talk a little bit about certifications, and I'll drop some things in the chat box as well. And I'll also be sure to include that in our follow-up email with resources. Share more on certifications. All right, that is the only question so far. So I will move on to ask you a different question, which is, what do you want to get out of this session? A bit earlier, we talked about the 4 objectives for the session, but beyond those 4 objectives, as attendees, what would you like to get out of the session? Please enter that information into the chat box. That information is helpful for me as I continue to organize and plan future workshops. It's helpful for me as I generate the content for the follow-up email. And then it's also very helpful for the panelists as they put together their remarks for the panel. So if you could share in the chat box, what do you want to get out of this session? I will give you a minute to think about that and to type in your responses. All right, the responses are starting to come in, which is really good. Grow base knowledge on D&I practices in order to grow my equity lens and apply it in the workplace and policy creation. Learn concepts and skills that we can use in our local and regional D&I committee and subcommittees. Broaden my awareness of resources to continue to build my knowledge of D&I topics and metrics. Baseline and perspective for D&I in West Michigan. To know the basic DEI term definitions and be able to teach others those definitions. Vanessa, there are some definitions in the D&I guidebook. So a majority of these came from a resource called the Diversity Best Practices, Inc., but we did cover some of that here. So if you wanted to look at page 5 in the guidebook, you could get a quick answer to that question. A few more responses coming in. Help find out what I don't know a lot of, learn new things, and find what areas I need to focus on. The foundational understanding chart is very intriguing. Identify knowledge gaps I have and how to close them. Developing measurable outcomes. We do talk more about measurable outcomes in future sessions when we talk about planning and leading. I'm not sure how much of that we'll cover today, but I do thank you for your contributions. All right, so thank you all for participating in that quick question and sharing what you want to get out of the session. Now I am very excited to turn things over to our panelists. I am excited to announce that we have Robyn Afrik, the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Ottawa County. Robyn was also a part of our last panel, so if you joined us on March 3rd, you already had the opportunity to hear a little bit about her and her story. We have Ken James, the Director of Inclusion for the Grand Rapids Area Chamber of Commerce. I've worked with Ken for the last few years. He's been a partner with other initiatives. He invited me to be a panelist during last year's summit, so it's been great working with him. And then we also have Dr. Michelle Loyd-Paige, who is the Executive Associate to the President for Diversity and Inclusion at Calvin University. Michelle is just a wealth of knowledge and resources, and she has so many great things going on in the D&I space, so I know that you all will learn a lot from her as well. So I am going to stop sharing my screen so that you all can kind of focus on our featured panelists. We're going to start out by just doing introductions. So they'll share a little bit more about what they do within their organization, maybe why they became interested in D&I, just some things like that so that you have a little bit of a better understanding about who they are as individuals and D&I leaders. So, and then after that, we'll get into some questions. I do have a few scripted questions to kick things off, but I imagine that as they talk and as they share their stories, questions will pop up from all of the attendees on the call. Well, that's the goal at least. So if a question pops up, I encourage you to enter that into the chat box. I will be monitoring the chat box and I will raise them to the panelists as they are entered. So I'm gonna stop talking for a moment, stop sharing my screen, and then we'll get into the introductions from the panelists. And then the order will be Dr. Michelle Loyd-Paige, and then we'll hear from Ken, and then we'll hear from Robyn. So with that being said, I am going to turn things over to Dr. Michelle Loyd-Paige.
Thank you, Whitney. It is a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. So again, my name is Michelle Loyd-Paige, and I serve as the Executive Associate to the President for Diversity and Inclusion at Calvin University, or the CDO, if the title is too long for you to say. And I would say that I began being involved in diversity work long before I did my academic work in this area, and that's because I was born Black and female and raised, I am a child of the late 50s and 60s, so all of that came into being, and my parents are also Black, and to everyone else in my family, my grandparents, to our knowledge. Of course, if you go far enough up the family tree, you'll find some of everybody there. But that's really when the consciousness and awareness began in terms of what that experience was like. Trying to find ways to communicate that experience or help others to know how to navigate that experience and what that looks like institutionally, that began in my academic career. I started in this work really as a professor of sociology at Calvin University. That's when I started my academic career. From there, moved into administrative work. I was the Dean for Multicultural Affairs for a while, and now in my current administrative role. The things that I am doing, or the things that keep me focused, is that I am, or things that I keep my hands in. I do this work at the university, helping at a strategic level, at a university-wide level. I also do some consulting on the side, helping other organizations, Christian organizations, nonprofit organizations in particular, and other educational institutions I also have a book that's coming out this fall to help, in particular, Christian organizations navigate diversity issues. And then also, I'm a co-host on a podcast where we have weekly conversations about biblical anti-racism. So I do a lot of this work all of the time. This is my passion. It used to be because I wanted to see things different in the world for me. Then it became I wanted to see things different in the world for my children. And now it's because I want to see things different in the world for my 4-year-old granddaughter. So we have a lot of work still to be done. Ken, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Loyd-Paige and Whitney as well, and to the panelists that you'll hear after me, Robyn. It's indeed an honor to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick as we do introductions. And while I'm doing that, I see some faces and some names. So for those of you that I have met before, good afternoon. And for those of you that I'm meeting for the first time, it's a pleasure to meet you as well. My name is Ken James, and I am the Director of Inclusion at the Grand Rapids Chamber of Commerce. And my pronouns are he, him, his. And again, it's an honor to be here. So I want to just kind of chat with you a little bit about a couple of things, because here we're going to talk about competencies for a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner. And so just a couple of slides to hold that space. One, I love this mantra here: diversity is a fact, inclusion is a behavior, but belonging is the emotional outcome that people want in their organization. So I share that with you. I lead diversity, equity, and inclusion services for our 2,400 plus members at the Grand Rapids Chamber and the business community. And so when we talk about starting these conversations and continuing these conversations, I always come back to this home base of where we want to evolve to. The other thing I want to share with you is that why do we do this? And so this slide here just shares with you about the growth that we're headed for. So if we really want to be intentional about being inclusive, but we're on the clock. And so I think it's very important for us to have these conversations, because we want to make sure, and again, I come from a business lens, that we attract and retain the best talent, not only at our specific organizations, but here in West Michigan. How do we stay as an innovative community? And that's having these conversations now so that we are culturally competent going forward. The other thing I want to share with you is return on investment. So a lot of times people think diversity, equity, and inclusion is a feel-good story, which it can be, or it's a response to something, which also it can be. But there is a true return on investment when you are intentional around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this comes with knowledge. 56% of businesses report increased performance when there's a strong sense of belonging in the workplace. 50% of employers report there is a 50% reduction in turnover risk by having diversity, equity, and inclusion. And when you can bring your authentic self to work, when you're valued, when you're appreciated, look at this, 75% reduction in sick days. Not to mention retention and not having the constant evolving door. So I just want to say, this is some of the why, this is some of the ROI. And then with knowledge, we want to always be on the cutting edge of what's next. I am a 26 plus year practitioner in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I've done that in a number of industries, but my most recent certification is through Coach Diversity Institute, where I'm recognized as an associate diversity coach. And I have my executive certification in diversity coaching. And I just obtained that this year. So I want to share with you, I practice what I preach. We all have our levels of expertise, but none of us know everything. Robyn will be up next to tell you a little bit about herself, and I'll stop sharing my screen. But before I do that, I want to just say, from knowledge standpoint, I have a couple of open-ended questions for you. And this, you don't have to answer it. Do you know the difference between a refugee and an immigrant? That's just something when we deal in the workplace, we have those conversations. What Hindu festival did we just celebrate this past Monday? Again, you don't have to answer it, but it's just something to know. If you think about, these are things that people in your workplace might want you to know. Do we know them? And then the third and final thing I'll share with you is today is the International Day of Trans Visibility. Many of us may know that, but also, did you know today is the day we recognize the life and contributions of Cesar Chavez. President Barack Obama made that a national recognition day in 2014. So again, being knowledgeable about things, it helps us in the workplace, because think of those things that I just laid out to you, that might in fact affect our workplace, and individuals know that we are appreciating them and valuing them where they come from by having the answers to those questions. It helps create a belonging workplace. So thank you. I look forward to chatting more. Robyn.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again for having me, Whitney, and it's great to see you, Ken and Dr. Michelle Loyd-Paige, always in amazing company. My name is Robyn Afrik, pronouns she, hers. I serve as the first director of diversity, equity, and inclusion for Ottawa County. In that role, I specifically create and lead our diversity, equity, inclusion strategy for the county, and I am working very closely with our local municipalities, townships, villages, and elected officials to do the same. Prior to this, I've had about 10 years of what I'd probably call formal diversity, equity, inclusion work, and that would be in specifically professional settings, whether that be corporate, nonprofit, community, etc. But I didn't arrive to it in the formal sense until I understood it from a personal approach. So I can say that what is culminated to today isn't really what I intended. And that it means to say I didn't wake up one day as a little girl saying, gosh, you know, I really want to be a DEI professional. I want to go to school and get that certification. It was rather as I began realizing how much of a lack there was for leaders and mentors, first and foremost in my personal life and community, that didn't A, look like me, and then B, was not accessible for me to help me understand some of the things that I had questions to. And also how, when Ken was talking about belonging, right, I didn't really understand what that was, given who I identified with. So being able just to go on that journey then is what has launched me into this space. And I find myself now really pioneering a lot of things that are trying to lessen the brunt, I guess you could say, for those who are coming after. So thank you.
Whitney, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now? I'm sorry. I was talking to you all on mute. Thank you so much, Robyn, and to all of our panelists for providing opening remarks. I do have a few questions just to kind of kick us off and get started. So the first question is, based on the knowledge competency statements on page 30 of the D&I guidebook, which resonated the most with you and why? Dr. Michelle Loyd-Paige, you are muted. You did the same thing I just did.
Yeah, I was trying to be respectful and not have all this stuff going on, but here we go. What I was saying is I'm glad for the question. And for me, it kind of depends on where you are and where you're starting. I think definitely knowledge is important, whether it's developing that knowledge through the relevant certifications. I mean, the training that Ken has gone through is fabulous. Understanding different content areas, key terms, all of that is really good. But I'd also like to say it's good to create personal networks as well, and to have networks to talk with other people who are doing this work, because we bring our own experience, our own self-awareness to the table. And sometimes we can't see what we don't fully understand. And so being in community with other diversity practitioners, being in community with people who have a different lens on the world, a different experience, bringing a different set of characteristics in terms of the embodiment, their particular embodiment of diversity, I think is very important, because that adds meaning to the knowledge, the facts that you are learning about diversity. So for me, it's a both and that resonates with me.
I would like to add to that a little bit. So
Ken, would you like to share next? Ken or Robyn, just kind of following suit with the same order with introductions?
All right, I would like to share. I'm happy to share next. I liked all three questions. You see me looking to my left. I have my book open to my left. But the second one, when you create a personal knowledge network, I am a huge proponent of not reinventing the wheel. So what's lessons learned? What can we do that work and what have we learned from? So when we have a network that we can rely upon to figure out, and we might have to tweak it to tailor our specific organization or our community or our region, but to figure out what's going on, what's cutting edge, what's trending. And I'm a big proponent of not reinventing the wheel, leveraging lessons learned and building on best practices. So all three of those are powerful statements, but the one that resonated the most with me is creating our own personal knowledge network for that very reason.
I think I'm going next, Whitney. So based on the knowledge competency on page 30 of the D&I guidebook, I feel that the competency statement that most resonated with me is probably going to be number 1, which is developing content knowledge that is critical to the effective D&I strategies. But also I'm going to throw in an added one, which is number 2 under the creating the personal knowledge networks. But I have to call out specifically within that grouping mentorship. So I think one of the questions or follow-up to this is, how do you apply this or provide this in real life examples of how and when? So in addition to working as a director in the county, I also am a professor at Hope College. And I know we have some individuals here on this call who also are in the education field. And so how I apply this actually is on a Monday evening through a classroom as a professor and teaching Encounter with Cultures. And it's really, I think, through this medium that is so vital to apply, the knowledge competencies, specifically understanding areas, right? Like bias, cultural competencies, legal compliance, historical roots. The way that I do that, there's really 3 ways. One of them is when I create the curriculum, which has their learning theories of practice and then application modules. The second is going to be when I'm moderating the conversations that come up in the classroom and through case studies. And the last is when determining how I'm going to score the rubric for demonstration of learning. And you have to, when you think about this, it's because students come to this classroom at a very different places of their journey. And they have probably not even, I've learned they haven't even dissected or analyzed their own individual identities or their value sets, let alone enough to put it through a lens of diversity, equity, inclusion. And so for me, I'm also recognizing that generationally, the students that are in my class also have very diverse worldviews. And so it's important for me to be able to have that knowledge in order to ensure that as these individuals, as future leaders, are going to be going into the organizations that you and I now are part of, that they are equipped, and that also we can check ourselves against the information and the knowledge that we're learning. Thanks.
Thank you. Ken and Dr. Michelle Loyd-Paige, would you like to provide any examples of how you are applying these competencies in your workplace?
Yes, like Robyn, I work in a higher education environment primarily. And one of the things that I do is I develop and facilitate the cultural competency professional development opportunities for our faculty and staff. So there are times when I'm using the knowledge, when I'm using what I'm learning, either through my own certification processes or through reading to develop these various topics. I'm using that knowledge to develop these sessions for the benefit of our organization so that individuals can do that. I also use my personal networks because there can be topics that I am not, it just needs another voice to speak into that. So most recently, there were a couple of sessions on anti-Asian violence. And while I felt comfortable doing those sessions, it just would be better symbolically, as well as just firsthand experience. We invited a couple of my Asian identifying colleagues to come and participate because they are doing diversity work as well in different contexts. So inviting their voices and to lead those sessions was very helpful, and I think a much more powerful presentation. And also, like Ken, I don't believe in reinventing the wheel if I don't have to. So if someone else has developed something that I might just need to tweak to present on my own campus, again, especially being in a Christian organization, sometimes the material that's readily available doesn't quite fit in our Calvin context. So I just have to shape it just a little bit, not totally change it, but tweak it just a bit. So those are the ways that I have leveraged that. And then just in my own growth and development as well, right? It's developing knowledge, not just to train other people, not just to help other people, but it's also helping me to be a better person. It's helping me to be a better citizen. It's helping me to be a better neighbor.
Thank you, Dr. Page. And the question, I will come back to it. So if everyone would indulge me, we'll bookmark that question. I've been looking in the chat as well, and I just wanted to offer a response to one of the questions about certificate and certification. The one, there is a little bit of nuance. Usually a certificate is something you can earn. It could be in person or remote, but it's a designation that you've done a bit of understanding around a particular topic. In this case, we're talking about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. You can get a certificate in that. And then there's certification, which is usually a little bit deeper, where there is a certifying body of some sort that has endorsed that you have a practice knowledge in said topic, and then you are indeed certified in that. So there is strength in both of those, and both of those create awareness. In my 26 years, there are many out there, and all of them valid. Some of them are industry specific, like someone that's in higher ed may want a certain certificate or certification maybe than someone that's in a for-profit sector, just to do those nuances. But in my professional experiences, the certificate programs through Cornell University are indeed highly recognized. There is a certificate Diversity Institute where you can get your certified diversity professional or certified diversity executive. That is also very reputable. And then my executive certification is through Coach Diversity Institute, which offers 4 different platforms through diversity coaching, and you can pick the platform that's best for you in there. So those are just, I wanted to highlight that as we go forward. But going back to our question about things that I'm leveraging around DEI in that space, I love diversity of thought. So when we think about diversity, we gravitate to what we can see. You can see some cases age, but race, gender, but diversity is much more than that. So I'll give you a specific example. One of the programs that I'm honored to work on behalf of the Grand Rapids Chamber is our Outpro program, which is for our LGBTQ plus community and their allies. And we do programming in that, but we have an outside counsel that comes in to help us shape the program. What's trending? What's the pulse? What's the education? How can we be making sure we're not unintentionally using the improper language, those things. So my point for giving you that example is surround yourself with different viewpoints, different experiences, whatever it is, to help you identify those blind spots. So that's an example of a knowledge base. You don't have to have all the answers, but if you're inquisitive and hungry and curious about the right answers, surround yourself with people that can provide those to you, and that can help you be a better implementer when it comes to DEI services.
I'm just going to tag team with Ken just for a moment. I just want to offer, and these are identified in the resources in the back of the book, but so Ken has executive level certification, which is great. One day I'll grow up to be like that. My certification, I'm a qualified CQ administrator. That's a cultural intelligence administrator, as well as a qualified intercultural development inventory administrator. So my certificate, as well as anti-racism facilitator, racial sobriety, but my certification, the path that I took is relevant to the work that I'm doing. So in terms of what are the services that we wanted to offer our faculty and staff on campus, the certification route that I chose was which would help me to administer or enable me to administer these instruments at a better rate. I'll put it that way. These are instruments that are also very helpful, but so the route of certification, I think, is looking at what is it that you plan to do with the certification? What is it that you need? What opportunities do you have? And what do you need it for? Unless you just have an organization that has all kinds of money that can just pour into you. And sometimes if it is needed, then yes, make that proposal to your organization leadership and say, this is needed for this organization so that I can be the best that I can be for this organization. So I just wanted to point that out, that there are multiple routes to doing that, but it all starts with, what do you need the certification for?
Michelle, I'm going to piggyback on that as well, because within our county, right? So I already also am CQ certified too, which is great. But instead of going for another D&I certification, I decided to go something very specific in public leadership. So hopefully being able to have those two connect at that level. But I appreciate your discernment and your approach that you just mentioned. So I just wanted to say that.
All right, so I have another question for the panelists. On page 31 of the D&I guidebook, the table topics for D&I officer training. Which 3 topics are most important to a D&I practitioner who is getting started and why? So on guidebook, page 31, which 2 or 3 topics are the most important to a D&I practitioner who's just started?
Whitney, I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record. It depends on your organization and it depends on the job that needs to be done. It really depends on how far along the path. You know, are you just starting? If your organization is just starting with thinking about diversity, just starting, then you want to look at diversity dimensions, just so that you know there's a difference between composition, interaction, systemic, there's institutional, there's a difference in what that looks like, right? If your organization is just starting to have a conversation about diversity, I would not recommend starting out with anti-racism conversation. You'll send everybody out the room screaming and hollering and weeping and wailing. I think where you start is, where is your organization? And then as you know where the organization is, what is the mission of the organization? What are you trying to figure out? Why does diversity matter to your organization? That's something I always tell people that I'm working with. Tell us why diversity matters. Well, I know why it matters to me. I know why it matters to Calvin. Why it matters to Calvin might not be the same reason it matters to you, to your organization. So figure out your why. If you don't know your why, yeah. And so what if your organization needs a push? Then you make the case, right? It's one thing to not know, but then it's find out, what is it about the mission of your organization that diversity matters? Tie it to mission. If you tie it to mission, you got to care about it, or you really don't care about the organization. So that's one. So I would say definitely diversity dimensions, because not all diversity is the same. Our why, I would put in there, find out what is the importance, and then find out how things get done, kind of change management. How do things change? So if it's policies that need to be changed, how does that happen within your sphere? It can look different in higher education than it looks in a nonprofit organization, than it looks in a corporation, than it looks in government. How do things change? And then I would say, what is the agreement, right? Because anytime we are working for an organization or an industry, there is some kind of contractual agreement that we have that we're making. What in that agreement states that diversity is something that's important? Is there anything in there? So finding that out, because that is something you can always point back to make the case of why this matters.
Robyn, I was pausing to see if you, okay, wanted to go. All right. Great question, Whitney, and I probably am a little bit jaded in this because I contributed to this resource, but it is a great foundational tool. And I remember you did your opening poll, and so there are some DEI practitioners here, but obviously there's some folks here that have an interest in DEI. So I would like to share my experiences, which is part of knowledge. So if any of you have ever attended one of my trainings, whether it was virtual and in person, I have a few go-tos that I say. And at some point in time, you're going to hear the word discernment, because discernment is part of this. And what I mean by discernment, when to speak up, how to speak up, the pace of your organization, what's important to your organization. The other part is grace. So sometimes for someone like me, I might think, wow, we should be further along. But as an organization, maybe they're just taking that first step. So we have to extend grace, but not lose sight of the work. The other thing that you will hear me say is my analogy on doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work. It has to be top down, or it's the likelihood of it being effective goes up tremendously when it's top down. So if you'll picture, and I've used this analogy before, if you will picture Niagara Falls in your mind, top down cascading approach, never ceasing. That's how I like to approach. Once we figure out the entry point, that's how I like to approach diversity, equity, inclusion. That is top down, there's buy-in, and it's consistent. And if something is uncovered, you don't abandon the process, you work through the process. Because remember, if something's uncovered, it's been there all along, but it's been festering. So you're dealing with that. There's a healing in the process, and there can be some things there. But I also want you to picture in your mind Old Faithful at Yellowstone National Park, where it erupts and people kind of come, take a look, and then it goes away. Not sure when it's coming back. So for instance, coming off of 2020, there are a lot of Old Faithful type incidents. Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Kenosha, Wisconsin. So from a business perspective, I am hesitant for an employer that approaches me and say, okay, George Floyd happened. Let's have a conversation on race, check the box and move on, kind of an Old Faithful approach. I try to say, no, it needs to be a different approach. Let's start that conversation and move it forward and to be consistent, because we don't want to open up this dialogue and then let that sit there. That can actually do harm as well. So when we think about this going forward and going back to your question, I look at that foundational list. So use your discernment. Where's the best entry point? How are we going to sustain it? I'll give this analogy. I have a lot of employers, again, coming through a business lens, say, Ken, help me create a workforce that mirrors the community. That's a noble practice, whether that's more women, whether that's more persons of color. You fill in the blank of the angle of diversity that they want to mirror the community. I asked the question, does your organization have the culture to retain that? So recruitment without retention is ineffective. So maybe simultaneously, while we're beefing up our recruitment, maybe we need to look at building up our culture. And then that's where those foundational pieces come in. So that's my recommendation on that. So use your discernment. What's the pace? Is it sustainable? And then then we have to create the culture. So that's my add to that question.
Ken, I'm going to just put one more little add to yours. Organizations don't have to wait until they have the picture of diversity to start creating a more welcoming and receptive culture within their organization. So if you wait until you have the numbers, whatever the numbers of people that you want, if you wait until you have the numbers, you're already too late. It's just like if you are inviting people to your house, you don't wait until the people are at your house, these visitors, to start cleaning up the house. You start, well, it's like if it's my house, you start straightening up the house before they get there. And then it feels more like a welcome. There's still more work to do once they get there, but you have to start working on that. So don't wait until you have the 5 African Americans, 5 Asian Americans, 5 LGBTQ, 5 people with disability. Don't wait until then. Start now. Start wherever you are to building a more welcoming community for the retention purposes.
I got nothing after that. You guys are great. Love it.
You really don't have anything to add? I'm so surprised.
Wow. I told you that I think it's great that these guys have the space to speak to this. So no, I'm good.
All right, so I just want to encourage everyone on the call to ask some questions. We have great panelists here. They have unique experiences. They're all from different walks of life. If you have any questions, feel free to ask of our panelists now. We do still have some time for the panel portion in the agenda, so we can definitely give it about another 10 minutes. If you have any questions based on any of the remarks, comments, or insights they share, or if you want to revisit kind of some of those things that you hope to get out of the session, I'm very happy that Ken circled back to talk about the difference between a certificate versus a certification program and just provide a few examples there. So thanks to Ken and Dr. Michelle Page. Closing move. But if there is anything that anyone asks, this is the perfect time to do that. We do have a question. Top to bottom concept. How do you know when the top gets it?
So maybe it's just the, what is today? Wednesday afternoon thing. It's like, oh, you know, you know, because it's, and maybe it's more, you know, when they don't get it. But in all seriousness, it's when, for me, one of the signs that someone in senior leadership gets it is that they can talk about this with cultural humility, and they can talk about this at times when there's not a crisis, when they can talk about the value added, when they can talk about the need for structural change and invite people to have that conversation with them about how to do that. And when they're willing to use their social capital as the leader to speak into this, and not just when there is a crisis. It's great if people spoke up and wrote a letter after George Floyd was killed. That's great. But can you talk about it when there hasn't been a mass shooting or a murder in the news? And can you talk about it as important for the organization, not just important for the world, right? Because any president should say diversity is important, and diversity is important for the organization. That's easy to say, but what are you doing? How are you presenting that? It's not just, and can they model participating in trainings and in workshops so that people can see it's not just a do as I say, but it's a do as I do. That for me is signs that senior leadership gets it.
That was really good feedback. Thank you. Robyn also put some comments in the chat. She said transparency, accountability, and budget. Robyn, did you want to speak more to that? And then we have a couple additional comments and questions coming in too. So panelists, feel free to read those comments and questions in the chat box and decide who's the best person to respond.
Thanks, Whitney. I'll just quickly say, and I've said this before in other spaces, a community or an organization can never move faster than what the leadership quotient is of that community or organization. So if their cultural intelligence, if their drive to do this work, whether it's intrinsic or extrinsic, is not farther out than what they're leading their folks, that is where you're going to see some challenges. And how they demonstrate that, which I love Dr. Michelle Loyd-Paige's examples, right? Is going to come through ways of how transparent are they really in their journey, and how are they holding themselves accountable as well as others in this space, and what are they using to create those changes? Is it structural? Is it budget? How much, right? And it's kind of like when people say they want to get in shape. It's a consistent workout. They have to continually work at this, and then make sure it bleeds into every part of the organization. So thanks.
I've been monitoring the chat and I jotted a few things down, so I'll respond. I don't know if they're in the proper order, but how do you know when the top gets it? I would approach that. Let's help the top get it. That's just my approach. So again, when I share about return on investment, and if you haven't picked up yet, I believe in the power of analogy and storytelling with that. So right now, if I did an activity with this group and I shared my screen and I went to Forbes.com, and if I typed in diversity, equity, inclusion in the Forbes.com search engine, there would be hundreds, if not thousands, of articles that reference the words diversity, equity, inclusion. And then you would see titles of articles like diverse workforce is 2.5 times more likely to turn a profit. Leadership teams that have women on it are 4 times more likely to be profitable. These are true articles that I've read on Forbes. However, what we lose sight of is that's when people can engage and bring their authentic selves to work, which comes back to the culture. So again, and so sometimes sharing that with top down, that there is a true ROI, will get that buy-in. The other thing is very easy to talk the talk. It's harder to walk the walk. So again, in my experience, we value this, but then there's no resources. So I think Robyn put in transparency, accountability, and do this. And then I want to give you another tip, and this is the power of words. So if you're being intentional about this, I grew up in a generation, no, sticks and stones, may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. We used to say that when we were kids. However, think about this. If you're an employer, and this, I'm giving you business right here in our community that hires returning citizens, that's my preferred language. How does one feel when you want to talk about welcoming? You say, we hire felons or we hire returning citizens? So I use that example about the power of words. So think about the language that we're using when we're talking about, people that might come from a marginalized background. And those things are what help preach the culture that gets the buy-in from the top down. So back to one of my favorite words, discernment. What do you have to show to your leadership to get the buy-in? What phrase, language, opportunity can you share? What quick win, can you get to get the solidified thing? And then the last thing that I'll share, if I interpret it correctly, there was a question about, buy-in from others. And so this is not easy to have these conversations, but it's necessary in my opinion. And I'll cut right through it. People say, well, how can we do something that doesn't vilify straight white males? And then I come to that and I say, well, one, the inclusion is not to alienate anyone. And what we're doing is moving toward an opportunity where we can all have equity. And then we can determine what that means. But if you're worried about introducing something that makes someone feel uncomfortable, think about the people that are dealing with the opposite of that daily. So we want to have a conversation to get us to a point of equity, and you're concerned about how we administer it. Let's ask ourselves, what about the people that are living it? How are they feeling on a daily basis? So usually, that will have someone say, stop for a moment and say, okay, we can do this webinar, we can do this training, we can read this book, we can have dialogue around this article. Because if you take the step back and look at the essence, there are people coming to work every day that are dealing with what we're talking about, and you're worried about us talking about it. So just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Ken.
We have two different questions. Go ahead, Dr. Loyd-Paige.
No,
I was just going to say, we have questions in the chat box that are related to that. Like, what do you do when you receive pushback? Or like, what strategies can you share to help some of those colleagues who may feel like they're being attacked? Like if they're a part of the dominant group during this training education, what strategies have you used when receiving pushback from white colleagues?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And I was starting to say, thanks, Ken. I appreciate that. In my mind, I think of this as a journey. We're on a road, on a highway, and my job is to create multiple on-ramps to get on this journey. And I don't want anyone to have an excuse that they can't because there's no way for them to get on it. So one strategy to help with, well, the question is like with resistance coming from some white people, I enlist other white people to have a conversation. So white people who are on this journey, who can talk about it, talk about their own experience. That's one of the sessions that we're having coming up at the end of April. It is white work, and it's a conversation, a live conversation with some of our white colleagues who are talking about how can you be a white person and do this anti-racism work, right? It'll sound different than if I'm telling white people what you can do, but other white people telling other white people what they can do to be a part of this journey and to talk about some of the challenges that they have, and to talk about how they negotiate that. So that's one thing. It's to figure out where is the pushback coming from? Why is there pushback? Because it's easy. Well, I have found for myself, I'll create a story for myself of why I think I'm experiencing resistance. And I have to tell myself in those moments, stop, ask the why. Don't assume. Don't assume why someone is resisting, or if it feels like resistance. So find out where it is coming from and address that concern. Because some people have some concerns that they feel are valid, and some of them could be valid. Some of them are like, where in the world did you get that from? If we're talking about white people, we're always going to be bashing white people. No, let's talk about that. So I try to create a trusting relationship. Again, that takes time to do so that people can trust that when I have a criticism or critique, that it's coming from a place of wanting to help us all to grow, not just piling on to a particular group. And then let's be honest, some people just don't want to do this. And I have learned, if you just don't want to do it, it is not my responsibility, because you are not paying me enough to make you want to do this, right? I'm not your mama. I don't have a heaven or hell to put you into. So if you don't want to, it's stressful enough to have to deal with someone who just violently doesn't want to. If you don't want to, bye. I'll just keep it moving. That doesn't mean I'll just intentionally leave someone out. I always assume someone wants to until they prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that they don't want to. And then it's not worth the headache. How do you get management to buy in? How do you get leadership to buy in? I think all the things that Ken has said. Look, I have done book groups with our cabinet. That's the executive leadership team. Part of my job is that I meet monthly individually with every vice president to help them in their own cultural competency journey. I have a curriculum that I'm using with them. Usually it's reading a book. We have questions that we're talking through. So it's building their knowledge. I'm getting to know them. They're getting to know me. I'm building their want to. They now want to do this work and they see how it benefits them. No one can say about diversity, this does not impact them, because it does. So if someone is a business owner and says, well, our primary business is making widgets, what does this have to do with us? Who do you want to sell the widgets to? How effectively do you want to sell those widgets? You need diversity. So that's what I'll say with that.
I'll just quickly add, one of the strategies that I've used we've used in the past, not necessarily the current space I'm in, but whenever there is a team or an organization where there is a majority dominant identity, and you're trying to understand, right, how you can lead that team into realizing that there is a need to have training where, like, again, the example provided in the chat box was saying, you know, we might get pushback from the white straight male. One of the things that we've had participants gather together to do is we ask them to all close their eyes and write down, after they think about it, who are the kinds of individuals that would be the most successful in that organization. What do they look like? What have they looked like? Who are making the decisions? What do you think of when you think of someone working at that organization, et cetera, et cetera. And 9 times out of 10, depending of course on the org, most people then will share as a group who that identity is. And 9 times out of 10, it is usually white straight males. And there's all kinds of research and historical context for that. But to be able to help individuals bring forth that subliminal bias that has been downloaded consistently without me having to tell them, but they actually recognizing it and calling it forth as a collective, and then saying, look, we're not here to say that you're bad or this is, like their negative situation, but to say this is why, right? We need to consider, this is what we call insider outsider culture. And so from that, then you're able to sort of manage a permission, if you will, to say, how can we all, right, join on, like Dr. Michelle Loyd-Paige referenced, where's our on-ramps? There is no threat in this, right? We all want to get better. And I think there's other great mentors and leaders who I've worked with that have also shared in the power dynamic around that and why that matters. So I just thought I'd throw that out there real quick as a 2 cents.
Ken, I wonder if you could respond to the last point in the chat, because when you opened in your conversations, you talked about the different observances. So how do you counsel different organizations about which celebrations to observe, and how do you do that in a very mixed context where you're not wanting to offend some, but you're wanting to affirm others? I wonder, from your vantage point, if you could address that.
Absolutely. And so there are complexities to this work, and there are layers to this work again. But when I encounter something like that, so again, I'm giving you my experiences. What you want to do is a collective and awareness piece. So oftentimes it's how you introduce the topic. One, this is voluntary to do this. And so a couple of examples in that case, if you were to do, and I know the lingo, a Good Friday, Easter egg hunt, bring your kids. If that was part of a larger inclusion calendar, and one that's voluntary, it's not intended, again, and this is not knowing the culture or all the context. So I would put a little bit more forethought and say, here's some activities we're going to be doing along the year. We're going to make sure it's inclusive and make sure you're not excluding anyone from that group. So, and I'll go back to, I've seen public schools, instead of doing a Halloween party, they do a harvest party. And for those that want to dress up, can. For those that don't want to dress up, can, but everyone still gets a treat, and those types of things. So I would just say you want to have a little bit of awareness, and that's where something like an inclusion council to help identify those blind spots would help in rolling out things like that without being offensive, because you don't want the unintended side effect of, now I feel alienated.
So it's the
Thank
question.
you, Ken, and to all of our panelists. Is now. Go ahead, Dr. Page.
Yeah. I was just going to say that the question is up. Do our organizations offer books, resources, or trainings to help a person build their knowledge? So, the university, there are both inward-facing opportunities and outward-facing opportunities. And I would say most of the ones that I am facilitating are more inwardly directed, but there are some things that are outward-facing. Yeah, books, just Google books go to Amazon, put in books, put in the keyword diversity. Things will pop up. View the Chamber of Commerce has lots of good resources. The back of this has some really good resources, but we're not able to, for the university, there are things that I put in the chat, early in the chat, my book that's coming out that was done with a colleague of mine at another institution. I've put that in there, but most of our things are internally facing as opposed to externally.
And I know you've got stuff at the chamber programs.
Correct. Actually, part of the resources that attendees will get today will list what we do at the chamber. And those are, and I'll highlight them, but you'll get the flyer. We do a diversity, equity, inclusion assessment. And it is an assessment. It's not a survey, it's an assessment. We offer implicit bias training. We offer the Institute for Healing Racism, and we offer culture and communication training. Just the nuance with that is we come armed with our lessons learned and best practices of meeting organizations where they're at. So whether this is your first step or whether you've been down the journey for a while and you want to navigate something new, we bring that to the table just so you're aware of that nuance as well.
For the county, very quickly, we are also, well, two things. We're inward focused as well. We do a lot of diversity book clubs and things like that for our employees to learn, but we do offer annually a diversity forum. And since I've been in the office, we've been doing it for the past 5-6 years prior to me coming, but we really expanded it in the fall of 2 years ago. We went down to the city, or excuse me, what was the Civic Center, and had about 300 people come. And really the theme that we are sticking with is Journeys to Equity. And we've highlighted many of our different partners across the state of Michigan leading best practices in this work. And we were online last year, but if you go to I can send the link to Whitney after this, but there's ways for you to register as well.
But so normally during the part of the transition, we will go breakout rooms at the same time because we can a little bit longer information to share. Instead of going into breakout rooms, I like to do this in one large group. There are only about 38 people still on the call, which is fine, but because the meeting attendance is a little bit lower, we can kind of share as a larger group instead of going into the breakout rooms. So just to do some reflection about the content that was shared today. When reviewing the expanding the knowledge base table on page 31, which topics are most relevant to you in my journey? Just something to think about. Which one of those topics, or which three of those topics are the most relevant? Look up the books and resources in the back of this book to continue to grow and expand your knowledge. But then I also do want to request to everyone who is still called. Number two, what resources, books, websites, or training can you share with a person to help them build their knowledge?
I'll jump in here. It looks like Whitney may have frozen, which is first world problems, right? We live in a virtual world. So these things happen. I just real quick before we get into our group discussions wanted to respond to one question someone had indicated about you see a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion officers or chief diversity officers in a number of spaces. I see K through 12 school districts hiring them now. I see counties. Congratulations, Robyn, for being the inaugural one for Ottawa County, doing these things. And I wanted to say, and I want to give you my opinion, while we have the floor here. I think that's great to have the lead for DEI and how it plays out, whether it's education, whether it's municipal government, whether it's healthcare, and those types of things. My concern is that analogy I gave you, the top-down approach. So are these individuals coming in? Is it sincere? Is there buy-in? Is there allyship? So I think it's sincere. And I have said that this is a mantra for me. DEI practitioners have to have some latitude and authority. So it's great and it's noble to start it off, but when you look at large institutions that want to sandwich DEI, in the sales department or the HR department, and not at a leadership level, but kind of several levels beneath, sometimes it's harder to get budgets. Sometimes it's harder to have your recommendations go as far as they need to go if there's no teeth to the position. So if it's sincere, if it's there, best practices, I think those things as a whole will bode well, but we want to be intentional about the framework. So that's my opinion on hiring a chief diversity officer.